Thomas Mercer stood on the edge of his property line, mouth agape, staring at what could only be described as an architectural abomination. A hulking, metal-sided garage now occupied the southeastern corner of his land. A corner that, until 3 days ago, when he'd left for a business trip, had contained nothing but tall grass and a cluster of young maple trees he planted the previous spring. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered, dropping his luggage onto the gravel driveway. The garage was substantial, easily large enough for 2 vehicles with what appeared to be a small workshop area attached to one side. Fresh concrete had been poured for the foundation, and the structure gleamed with the unmistakable newness of recent construction. Someone had built this monstrosity with remarkable speed and efficiency, and they had built it squarely on his property. Thomas had purchased this 5-acre plot in rural Pennsylvania 3 years ago after divorcing his wife of 20 years. The land represented his fresh start, a quiet place where he could build the modest ranch-style home he'd always wanted, plant a garden, and maybe raise a few chickens. He'd spent countless weekends clearing brush, marking boundaries, and planning the layout of his dream property. The southeastern corner, with its natural sunlight and protection from the prevailing winds, had been designated for his future greenhouse project. Now it housed a stranger's garage. Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Harold Benson, the county surveyor who had confirmed his property lines when he first purchased the land. "Harold, it's Thomas Mercer. I've got a situation here that requires your immediate attention," he said when the surveyor answered. "Someone has built a structure on my property without my knowledge or permission. I need you to come out and confirm the boundaries again so I can take appropriate action." Harold arrived 45 minutes later, equipment in tow, and began taking measurements. Thomas paced nervously, occasionally glaring at the neighboring property, a sprawling ranch belonging to the Callahan family. The Callahans had moved in about 8 months ago, and Thomas had made a point to introduce himself shortly after their arrival. Connor Callahan had seemed pleasant enough, if somewhat brusque, during their brief interaction. "Well, there's no question about it," Harold said finally, folding up his tripod. "This structure is sitting a good 30 feet inside your property line. No gray area here, it's definitively on your land." Thomas thanked Harold and paid him for his time, then stood contemplating his next move as the surveyor's truck disappeared down the rural road. The logical course of action would be to contact the Callahans directly before involving authorities. Perhaps there had been an innocent misunderstanding about property boundaries. It seemed implausible that someone would build such an expensive structure without confirming ownership of the land, but stranger things had happened. As Thomas approached the Callahan residence, he noticed Connor in the front yard tinkering with a riding lawnmower. "Afternoon, Connor," Thomas called out, trying to keep his voice neutral despite his simmering anger. Connor looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to something that resembled defiance. "Thomas," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "I just returned from a business trip to find a garage built on my property," Thomas said, getting straight to the point. "Did you authorize that construction?" Dawn had barely broken when Thomas heard the rumble of trucks approaching his property. He'd scheduled the demolition crew for 8:00 a.m., but a glance at his bedside clock showed it was only 6:15. Confused, he threw on a robe and stepped onto his porch. What he saw made his blood run cold. A small crowd had gathered along his property line. Connor Callahan stood front and center, arms crossed, flanked by at least a dozen people. Thomas recognized several neighbors he'd only met in passing, the clerk from the local hardware store and even Deputy Wilson from the sheriff's department, though the deputy appeared to be off-duty in civilian clothes. Behind Callahan's impromptu militia sat 3 pickup trucks and a local news van, its young reporter already setting up a camera. A hand-painted banner strung between 2 poles read, "Protégez small business from city ULEs." "What the hell is this?" Thomas muttered, stepping off his porch and approaching the group. Callahan stepped forward, a self-satisfied smile playing at his lips. "Morning, Mercer. Heard you were planning some unauthorized construction work today. Thought we'd come by and make sure everything's on the up and up." Thomas scanned the crowd. Several people held coffee cups and thermoses. One man had brought a folding chair. They were settling in for the long haul. "This is private property," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're trespassing." "We're on the road easement," Callahan replied smoothly. "Public right-of-way. And we're just exercising our First Amendment rights to peaceful assembly." The reporter from the local news station approached, microphone extended. "Mr. Mercer?" "Caitlin Walsh from Channel 4 News. We understand you're planning to demolish a local business today without a court order. Would you care to comment on why you're taking such drastic action?" Thomas blinked, momentarily stunned. I mean the business is operating illegally on my property. I have survey documents that prove. But isn't it true that you're relatively new to the area?" The reporter interrupted. "And that the Callahan family has been part of this community for generations." Thomas felt a surge of indignation. What does that have to do with property rights? He built on my land without permission. The camera was rolling, capturing every word. Thomas suddenly realized he was standing in his bathrobe, hair disheveled, voice rising with each sentence. He was being painted as the villain in this carefully orchestrated media ambush. The situation deteriorated further when his phone rang. It was Pete Donovan from the demolition company. "Mr. Mercer, we're going to have to reschedule," Donovan said apologetically. "Got a call from the county building inspector this morning. Says we need a special permit for demolition in your township. Could take a couple weeks to process." Thomas knew instantly that this was Callahan's doing. Another delay tactic using local connections. He ended the call and retreated to his house, ignoring the reporter's shouted questions. Inside, Thomas paced his living room, alternating between rage and disbelief. The crowd outside remained for hours, turning the event into something of a block party. Someone had brought a grill and was cooking hot dogs. Through his window, Thomas could see Callahan giving interviews, gesturing animatedly toward the garage. By mid-afternoon, Thomas's phone was buzzing with messages from friends who'd seen the local news coverage. The story had been framed exactly as Callahan intended: local business under threat for newcomers' legal technicality. When Thomas finally called his attorney, Wilcox was furious. "This is exactly why I told you not to take matters into your own hands. Now he's controlling the narrative. The judge will see this, Thomas. It doesn't look good." That evening, as the crowd finally dispersed, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, drafting and redrafting a statement for the press. Nothing sounded right. Every explanation came across as defensive or entitled when written down. His phone pinged with a news alert. The story had been picked up by regional outlets. Rural David and Goliath. Small business owner fights to save livelihood. The accompanying photo showed Callahan standing proudly beside the garage, a sympathetic family man protecting his American dream. There was no mention of property lines or unpermitted construction. As darkness fell, Thomas realized he was running out of conventional options. The court date for the property dispute was still 3 months away. The local media had already decided who was right and wrong. And now, even the simple act of removing a structure from his own property had become legally complicated. 2 days after the garage's mysterious disappearance, a sheriff's deputy arrived at Thomas's door with a search warrant. A document authorized law enforcement to search Thomas's property for stolen automotive equipment and parts, valued in excess of $50,000. $50,000? Thomas exclaimed, scanning the warrant. That's ridiculous. The entire garage wasn't worth that much. Deputy Mills, a stern-faced woman Thomas hadn't met before, remained professionally detached. "Sir, I'm just executing the warrant. Mr. Callahan has provided an itemized list of missing property, including several rare vintage car parts and specialized tools." For the next 3 hours, Thomas sat on his porch watching as deputies combed through his small cabin and outbuildings. They searched his shed, his car, even the crawl space beneath his house. Thomas remained outwardly calm, offering coffee to the officers and answering questions with polite brevity. By mid-afternoon, it was clear they had found nothing. Before leaving, Deputy Mills paused at Thomas's porch. "Mr. Mercer, off the record, this feud between you and Callahan has the entire department exhausted. Whatever happened to that garage, I'd suggest you both find a way to move past it." Thomas nodded noncommittally, but her words resonated. The dispute had consumed nearly half a year of his life, draining his finances and stealing the peace he sought when moving to the country. The following week brought new developments. First, a formal letter from the county zoning board informed Thomas that his property had been reported for multiple violations, including unpermitted land clearing and improper waste disposal. The letter mandated an inspection within 10 days. Then came the lawsuit. Callahan's new attorney, a high-powered litigator from Philadelphia, not the local lawyer he'd originally retained, filed a civil suit seeking $157,000 in damages. The complaint alleged not only theft and destruction of property, but also defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and interference with business relationships. $157,000. Thomas nearly shouted during an emergency call with his attorney. For a garage that cost him $20,000 at most. "It's a shock and awe tactic," Wilcox explained. "They're hoping to scare you into a settlement. The good news is that our countersuit for the original property incursion is finally moving forward. The judge has scheduled both cases to be heard together next month." Thomas hung up and immediately called the self-storage facility, confirming that his unit was secure and that no one had inquired about it. The dismantled garage and its contents remained his only leverage, physical proof of Callahan's trespassing, should he ever need it. That evening, as Thomas reviewed the mounting legal documents spread across his kitchen table, headlights swept across his front window. A car had pulled into his driveway. Heart pounding, Thomas peered through the curtains, half expecting to see Callahan or perhaps more deputies with another warrant. Instead, a middle-aged woman emerged from a modest sedan. She approached the porch hesitantly, glancing back at her car several times as if reconsidering her decision. Thomas opened the door before she could knock. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Mercer, my name is Eleanor Whitman. I used to live in the Callahan house before them." Thomas studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Please come in." Over coffee, Eleanor revealed why she had sought him out. "I saw the story on the local news about the garage dispute. When they showed your property line, well, I knew something wasn't right. That corner of land has always belonged to your parcel." "You're sure about that?" Thomas asked. She nodded firmly. "My late husband and I owned that house for 32 years. We always knew exactly where the boundary was. There used to be an old stone marker at the property." 3 weeks after Thomas's moving truck departed, Connor Callahan stood in his front yard, smirking as he watched a real estate agent hammer a sold sign over the Force SAL placard on Thomas's property. The rumor around town was that Mercer had cut his losses and fled, unable to withstand the pressure of the lawsuit and the united front of the community. "Good riddance," Callahan muttered, finishing his morning coffee. From his perspective, the property dispute had ended exactly as it should have. The outsider had been driven away, and the natural order of the community preserved. He'd have to find another location for his garage eventually, but he considered that a small price for the satisfaction of victory. Callahan's celebration proved premature. The following morning, the sleek black SUV rolled up Thomas's driveway. A tall, distinguished man in an impeccable suit emerged, accompanied by 2 younger associates carrying tablets and measuring equipment. They walked the property line methodically, making notes and taking photographs, paying particular attention to the concrete slab where the garage had once stood. Callahan watched from his window, unease growing by the minute. When the man in the suit approached his front door, Callahan opened it before he could knock. "Connor Callahan?" the man inquired, extending a business card. "I'm Harrison Wells, General Counsel for Eastern Seaboard Development Corporation. I wanted to introduce myself as your new neighbor." Callahan glanced at the card, confusion evident on his face. "Eastern Seaboard? You bought Mercer's property?" Wells smiled thinly. "Not exactly. Mr. Thomas Mercer is now our Director of Rural Acquisitions. He identified this area as ideal for our newest project and sold us his parcel as the anchor property." "Project? What project?" Callahan asked, a note of alarm creeping into his voice. "Our Woodland Hills estate development," Wells replied smoothly. He gestured to one of his associates, who produced a glossy brochure and handed it to Callahan. 65 luxury homes on 1-acre lots with a community center, pool, and tennis courts. Very exclusive, very upscale. Callahan stared at the architectural renderings in the brochure. A planned community of enormous homes clustered together, with manicured lawns replacing the natural woodlands. "This is residential farmland," he sputtered. "You can't build all this here." Wells' smile never wavered. "Actually, we can. The county zoning board approved our application this morning. Apparently, there's a provision in the township bylaws allowing for high-density development if it brings significant tax revenue to the area. Our project qualifies handily." "That's impossible," Callahan insisted. "My uncle sits on that board. He would have told me." "Ah, yes, Michael Callahan," Wells interrupted. "He recused himself from the vote due to conflict of interest. Once we informed the board about your pending litigation with our director, Mr. Mercer. Something about a garage illegally built on his property. The board felt it would be inappropriate for your uncle to vote on a matter involving family disputes." Callahan's face reddened. "This is some kind of trick. Mercer put you up to this to scare me." "I assure you, Mr. Callahan, Eastern Seaboard Development Corporation is very real, and our $18 billion in completed projects across 5 states is very real." Wells reached into his breast pocket and retrieved another document. "Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. We'd like to present you with an offer to purchase your property as well." Callahan glanced at the figure on the offer sheet and nearly choked. It was triple the market value of his home. "Why would you?" "Your parcel is crucial for our community entrance and security gate," Wells explained. "We could proceed without it, but it would be far more convenient to incorporate your land into our design. The offer is good for 72 hours, after which we'll finalize alternative plans." As Wells and his team departed, Callahan stood frozen in his doorway, the purchase offer clutched in his trembling hand. His mind raced through the implications. Dozens of new neighbors, construction noise for months, property values fluctuating wildly, the character of the rural community forever altered. Everything he had fought to protect suddenly threatened by forces far more powerful than a single unwanted neighbor. Callahan spent the next 48 hours in a frenzy of activity, calling his uncle, consulting his attorney, reaching out to other zoning board members. Everywhere he turned, he encountered polite but firm resistance. The development had been approved, permits were being processed, and construction would begin within 60 days. On the morning of the third day, Callahan made a phone call he never imagined making.